Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Managing Director and Market Manager for J.P. Morgan Chase, Pete Chillian.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Great to have you here. My name is Pete Chillian. I'm responsible for the private banking business for J.P. Morgan here in the Dallas region. And on behalf of my many colleagues at J.P. Morgan Chase, let me just tell you how proud we are to be a sponsor of today's Policies to Promote Inclusive Urban Growth Conference here at the wonderful George W. Bush Institute. As a firm, we are deeply committed to driving inclusive economic growth in some of the most underprivileged neighborhoods that we serve by serving our communities and helping more people to move up the economic ladder. Through our model for driving inclusive growth, we're undertaking significant, long-term, coordinated efforts in the communities all around the world. These initiatives are focused on what we believe will have a lasting long-term impact. Things such as enhancing job skills, expanding small business, revitalizing neighborhoods, and promoting financial health. So naturally, when you think about that, it was a real honor and just a no-brainer, frankly, for us to be a sponsor of a conference where solutions for some of these bigger picture issues are going to be talked about today. The esteemed panel today is made up of really some of the leading national urban thinkers who will discuss what we have learned and again, talk about solutions to achieve more inclusive cities in the decades ahead. We believe really, we do a lot of things at J.P. Morgan Chase, but there is nothing more important and no better investment that our firm can make than to help people to achieve more economic prosperity. So with that, I am going to have the privilege of introducing our next panel, Cities of the Future, a Call to Action. I'm going to invite our panelists to go ahead and come on out as I am introducing them. You've already heard from Joel Kotkin. Joel is one of the world's preeminent authors on cities. He's the author of 9 books, including The Human City, Urbanism for the Rest of Us, and he writes regularly for the City Journal and the Daily Beast. He speaks about cities and demographic change all over the world, and he's finishing a new book on America's shift towards what he calls a modern form of feudalism. Thank you, Joel. Also joining the panel is Mr. Henry Cisneros. In 1981, Henry became the first Hispanic American elected mayor of a major U.S. city, San Antonio, Texas, where he still resides. Between 1993 and 1997, he served in the Clinton administration as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. As a national policymaker, Secretary Cisneros played a key leadership role in launching successful urban revitalization effort across the country and initiating policies which contributed to achieving the nation's highest ever homeownership rate. Very impressive. Secretary Cisneros is the founder and chairman of the CityView companies, which have partnered in building some 7,000 homes in 13 different states around the country. He currently serves as principal and chairman of the executive committee of Siebert Cisneros Shank & Company, a full-service investment banking and financial services company. Until recently, he served on the advisory board of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Secretary Cisneros continues to lead as one of America's most prominent advocates for homeownership and inclusive urban development. And our last panelist is my colleague at J.P. Morgan Chase, Peter Scheer. Peter is head of corporate responsibility for the firm. He sits on our operating committee. He's also chairman of the Mid-Atlantic region for J.P. Morgan Chase. He also oversees the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation, which, as many of you know, is one of the nation's largest corporate foundations. He's made us very proud by leading many of the firm's flagship programs. You'll hear about some of them today, but including, for example, the $100 million plus investment into Detroit's revitalization, similar efforts in Chicago and some other cities. This is a big reason why our firm was yet again named as one of the top 10 most admired companies by Fortune magazine. I will add that we are the only bank in that top 10 list as well. Today's panel is moderated by Cullum Clark, Director of Economic Development for the George W. Bush Institute, and also dear friend of mine in J.P. Morgan Chase. So let's please give it up for today's panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete. It is really wonderful to have you and Elaine and so many dear JP Morgan friends here today. Thank you so much for everything you all are doing. So speaking of JP Morgan, Peter, let's start with you. A widening opportunity gap is affecting cities everywhere. We've been hearing all about it today, and you've led the charge in redefining corporate responsibility at JP Morgan Chase. Can you tell us a little bit about the bank's model for addressing all these challenges and why it's working?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you all, excuse me, for having me. It's a great honor to be here and to particularly talk about this issue, which frankly is an issue all over the world. You know, we saw, particularly coming out of the financial crisis now, almost 10 years ago, this widening disparity and the challenges that it created in the community and communities. And, you know, frankly, we made a decision we had to get a lot more serious about it. And I think, you know, corporate philanthropy has always been very well intentioned, but it's often involved just writing big checks and hoping for the best. And we felt it wasn't enough. And what we really needed to do was understand what are the challenges facing communities across the country and frankly across the world, and where could we bring unique capabilities? And so we identified several areas, and people, you know, Elaine and Ann Motzenbacher's here, were very involved in helping us define, you know, where we could make a particular unique difference. And we looked at issues around education and the skills gap. How are we training people for the jobs that are actually being created? We looked at neighborhood disinvestment. We looked at small business, and particularly the challenges that minority entrepreneurs are getting. We looked at financial capability, and we decided instead of focusing on 100 things, we would focus on 4 things very deeply. We hired some people. We were talking about Janice Bowdler, who's a co-author of Henry Cisneros, who really had some background experience in this. And frankly, Detroit, which Pete mentioned, was the first opportunity to really bring this together and demonstrate that when you're working with a city that's working together and collaborating, you can make a difference. The final thing I'll say is, one of the things that we thought is very important is making sure that you have the institutions on the ground that could deliver. This can't just be JP Morgan Chase coming in and solving problems, but do you have the right business and nonprofit and public sector working together? And that's frankly been the key in most of the places we've served, and we've found impact, and we're hoping to take this model other places.
Thank you. Secretary Cisneros, or you suggested that I could call you Henry.
Henry's good.
Well, you have been a senior national leader in obviously government, but also the nonprofit and business sectors for a great many years.
Thank you.
How can all these sectors come together to move the needle in the issues we're talking about today?
Well, we have to come together and bring all the pieces together. I have always felt that the way America works best is when we approach these kinds of issues in a two-fisted fashion. And I used to say as mayor, you know, there's no such thing as a good boxer who has only one punch. You've got to have, you know, kind of multiple strategies. And the first strategy is growth. Continue to grow the American economy. And that's a challenge. And it's a particular challenge in a time when the American economy is changing. This is particularly important to cities because we come through this period we call the urban crisis. But in my view, what we call the urban crisis was actually the transformation of the American economy. It coincided with the offshoring and the moving of manufacturing out of cities where 30% of the jobs were in manufacturing. Even cities you don't think about as manufacturing cities like Dallas and Los Angeles had 30% of their jobs. Look at the numbers for the 1950s and 60s. You would have found about 30% of the jobs in manufacturing. Today, the new American economy is new media, professional services, international trade, technology, medical, higher education, completely different mix, but very urban friendly. So the sectors you describe have to come together to keep that momentum for growth. But the second fist that has to hit with equal force is figuring out how to take some of that growth and harness it, make it available so that we can take people who are marginalized and bring them into the economy. And that means things like real focus on education and human capital, community colleges and pre-K and all of the strategies we're seeing now across the country. It means things like focusing on mobility so we can get people from poor neighborhoods to where jobs are, really workable mobility strategies. It means things like focusing on the infrastructure that is needed to support the growth, but making sure when we do it, we're at a point of inflection where we're transforming the electrical grid to renewables, for example, and putting in new forms of mass transit, all kinds of, this is a moment where technology applications are changing virtually every aspect of the infrastructure support for our metropolitan areas. As we do that, make sure some of those jobs, some of that opportunity accrues to people who've been on the outside, whose incomes we want to raise. So that's a lot of moving parts and a lot of pieces, but it certainly requires a collaboration between all the elements. Two quick final points. A key element of this is intentionality. Local communities have to decide intentionally that they want to create this harness between the growth opportunities and the human capital needs, intentionality. And the second piece then is structures for collaboration. It's not good enough just to talk about this among the leadership elite at a cocktail party. You got to have venues, systems to listen to people, bring people together, take all that energy and make it come together.
Thank you. Joel, it's been tremendous to work with you on this new report, Beyond Gentrification. And in fact, should tell everyone, we're going to send links to the report to everyone who registered for the event, and we have a number of hard copies out there. So you entitled this report, Beyond Gentrification. Joel, what does it mean for cities to move beyond gentrification?
Well, I think what we had initially was, and it was in some senses a positive thing, is people were rediscovering the advantages of being in an urban location. And so we had this sort of period, which I think has now come to an end. Wendell and others who have done the demographics, the shift into the cities has really slowed very dramatically. New York's population growth is about 80% below what it was just a few years ago. Cities like San Francisco that were gaining population are from the rest of the country are now losing. But we had this very heady period, and it, you know, my old Japanese sensei used to say to me, the hardest thing is how to unlearn the secrets of your past success. And this strategy worked really pretty well, particularly in certain cities, but there were two big problems. One, it didn't help a lot of other people, and my sometimes debate partner, but also friend, Rich Florida, has made this point that this great urban renewal, urban renaissance, has never really reached a large percentage, even the majority of the people in these urban areas. So that was the other problem. But the other issue is that the kind of economy that we've created, that mayors seem to be interested in, is basically only a few sectors, maybe finance, media, and obviously parts of the technology industry, but not a lot of emphasis on middle-class jobs. You can't keep a middle class in a city without there being middle-class jobs. So, you know, as Henry and I were talking about, bringing a Toyota, for instance, to San Antonio was a transformative thing for that city. And it doesn't have to be just manufacturing. Toyota moving their U.S. headquarters to the Dallas area is a big positive thing. You know, sometimes when I fly to Dallas, I'm sitting next to a woman who, she's Japanese American, and she's going to visit her sister who's just moved to Dallas and said, wow, did she buy a big house? You know, so, so I think that there are really two things. One, we have to understand that this gentrification creative class strategy has kind of played itself out. It played a role, they have some positive effects, but it sort of, in a sense, it created its own undoing by making things so expensive. So that, I think we have to understand that that's come to an end, and that what we need to do is begin to diversify our urban economies so that there are jobs, not this dichotomy we have now, we see in LA all the time, very high-end jobs and then lots of very low-end jobs. I mean, and we just can't go this way. I'll just leave you with one thought. A very good mayor, Tom Tate, who just is just termed out as mayor of Anaheim. Tom would go down to to where there was a homeless encampment by the Santa Ana River, and he'd interview the people. And the fact that numerous of those people were working for Disney, one of the wealthiest companies in the world, and they were homeless, is a sign that something isn't working. We have to figure out how to get wages up and how to bring in the kind of industries that will provide some upward mobility. That requires changes in the education system, because one of the things that we've heard, I was just at a guy who does internal design of buildings. He says, in LA, can't find carpenters, can't find electricians, can't find really basic skilled people, because particularly in the state of California, our community colleges don't do that. They're all pushing people to get 4-year degrees in some irrelevant skill where they'll never get a job.
Clark,
Yes.
If I may, I just want to pick up on a point
right in.
that Joel has made, and that is the opportunity is there to create more inclusion in our society. The very theme of this conference, it's very timely, it's very correct. And it's a great thing to happen in Dallas as well, because Dallas can be a kind of a national model because the juice, the economic momentum is there. And just figuring out how then to bring people into the mix is the challenge. First of all, this is going to happen in America in localities. It's not going to happen because the federal government mandates it. Federal government is not in position, nearly bankrupt, and with huge deficits into the sunset, and no ability to sort of create a consensus about anything, a stalemate on policy, as we see so clearly. And the states are very important. They have things that could impact equity and inclusion, like public education, higher education, health, but you don't find that sort of equity lens applied at the state level. But cities see the problems before them and live with the problems, and so these things are going to be settled, in my judgment, at the local level. And we just have to believe that we can do this. The opportunity is there almost in an unprecedented way. It's true what Joel says, that some cities' growth has slowed, but it's still pretty significant in a lot of places. New York City still is on a track to get to 9 million people from the 8 million that they were just a few years ago. And places like Amazon choose New York because the basic conditions are there for growth and jobs.
And Washington.
And Washington, Northern Virginia. So my point is, it's going to happen at the local level. It's going to happen where there are communities that understand the significance of this and why we have to do this as a country. And it's going to happen where the structures exist for people to meet and talk and work together. When Atlanta decided that it was going to embark on the course that put it to being the place that has held the Olympics, is going to have the Super Bowl this weekend, they started a series of brown bag lunches between the African-American preacher community, the ministers, and the then frequently segregationist public officials. And they met every other week in a high school gym for lunch. And out of that came that phrase, Atlanta, a city too busy to hate. And what we've seen is the unbelievable progression of Atlanta when they did things like build the airport that has connected them to the rest of the world, and brought company headquarters there that are not just for the Southeast U.S., but for the whole country. It really is a place that has intentionally set out to be more equitable.
So let me build on this, because I just on Joel and Harry's comments. We know this is coming. I mean, today you've got a little more than half the world's population living in cities. By 2050, it'll be almost 2/3. We know where people want to live. We know where young people want to live. We know the impact of that. So we've got to get ahead of it. And I think part of the challenge that we are grappling with is how do you leverage the economic development that's going to be occurring in the downtown and the midtown areas of cities for a more inclusive, equitable. And so I'll give you a couple examples. I'll give you a bunch of examples, but in Washington, in the Washington area where I live, there's a effort underway to connect the kind of Anacostia area to Capitol Hill area through a bridge called the 11th Street Bridge Project, okay? We know today, even before a shovel has been put in the ground, that is going to cause displacement of housing, small businesses, and so we are very, very invested in an effort underway to deal with that before it happens. So we've created a land trust to ensure that there's more, that we maintain affordable housing. We're creating funds for small businesses. We're also importantly training people in these areas for the jobs that are going to be needed to build. We're doing that as well. Paris, as an example, some of the wealthiest cities in the world within a mile or two have some of the highest rates of poverty. So Paris, which you think of, should have plenty of resources, 2 or 3 miles away, 40% poverty, unemployment. But now the Olympics are coming. How do you use these big events, whether it's an airport or the Olympics or new infrastructure, to be training people for those jobs, to ensure that you have the right flow of affordable housing? And I think Henry's point, you have to have everyone together at the table. One of the challenges that we saw in Detroit, in an effort to extend housing into the neighborhoods, you didn't have enough contractors. You didn't have enough builders. So one of the things the mayor said to us, how do you create the financing mechanism so people who normally couldn't get access to capital can do it? We created with the Kellogg Foundation something called the Entrepreneurs of Color Fund. People who couldn't get normal access to regular access to capital, in the first 2 years, we had 1 default. It's now a $22 million fund. It's in 5 different cities. But the only way those things come about is if everyone's at the table, having the conversations, identifying the challenges, and coming up with solutions. In too many cities, everyone's moving in their own direction, and it just doesn't work.
Peter, let me follow up with you on that topic. Forbes magazine called the bank's engagement in Detroit a blueprint for rebuilding American cities.
It's true.
Why did the bank take this on, and why? And tell us how it's working out.
So, we had been part of Detroit for 80 years in one form or another, and we watched this slow, steady decline over many years. And then the fall of 2013, you started seeing a glimmer. You saw a new mayor, Democratic mayor, getting elected, talking to a Republican governor, not about partisan politics, but about how do we fix the problems? How do we really identify? You saw the business community and the nonprofit sector all coming together. And frankly, it was our boss, Jamie Dimon, who said, see what we can do to help. And we went in, and we can't come up with a plan, but we have that kind of collaboration that Henry talked about on the ground. We can be a real accelerant for it, and we can bring in our expertise. And we identified within our scope of expertise 3 or 4 areas that we could help. We invested $100 million. Within 2 years, it was so successful, it went up to $150 million. And but we're trying to create a market, and part of it is, and I heard in the other panel talking about, how do you make sure capital is flowing? When we first started there was basically no market capital. It was all government, philanthropic capital. What you're now starting to see, and you still need some of the lower cost capital, you're now starting to see market capital, people coming in and seeing an opportunity, frankly, to long-term investment. So it's been an enormous success. The commercial and residential real estate values had double-digit gains in the last 2 years. You see people coming back into the city. And I will say also, we've been having these conversations around Dallas. Small business has been a huge driver of growth and jobs, particularly minority. 4th largest minority small business sector in the country, has some of the largest gains. And so just thinking about those scope, and it's worked, and we want to try to do it other places.
Any other places that are high on the list?
Would you have any? Listen, we're looking. We've now made investments in Chicago, in Washington, in Paris. We've got some early investments in Dallas, and we're looking at what we can do. We want to listen. Dallas is an incredibly important market for us. It's growing. I've never had an easy time saying no to Elaine Agathar. So we are looking at what we can do, and we want to be part of growing this community. And look, let me just say, it's in our interest to grow this community. It's in our business interest to grow this community. And the divisions that we see in society today, the economic divisions, the racial divisions, are not good for the private sector. And so we have to be part of the solution, and we will be.
I was going to say we have something in common. I would never be able to say no to Elaine either. But Henry.
No, I was just going to say, I have seen what J.P. Morgan has done in Detroit. It is real. Detroit is really coming back. It once had 2 million people. It dropped to 650,000. Imagine putting a third as many people on the same geography that was before. It causes problems, immense problems, just that. But coming back in a strong way, and J.P. Morgan has been a very important part of that, led by the most visionary financial leader in the country today, Jamie Dimon. But I would also say that there are other pieces of the equation that need to be put in place. And clearly one of those is education. There's a whole host of cities in America today that are focusing on pre-K education. My own hometown, San Antonio, we passed a sales tax. The people voted for a sales tax to create buildings that look like community colleges, but everybody there is 4 years old. And we have thousands of children now in preschool to be ready to learn when they arrive at first grade. The community colleges. You have one of the best community colleges in the country in the Dallas Community College, and linking it to the new wave jobs and getting deeper into the neighborhoods, hugely important. It's a massive resource, in addition to, of course, the public schools and higher education in the city. Mobility, linking people not just with a few rail routes, which are exceedingly expensive, but other forms of mass transit. Some cities, for example, are contracting with Uber and Lyft to do what's called the last mile from the bus system. So literally, people are picked up in routes throughout neighborhoods and brought to where the mass transit system operates to get people to jobs. And then another piece of the equation is philanthropy. I think you would agree that Kresge Foundation played a huge role in organizing the effort in Detroit. And philanthropy is changing. You take a United Way in most cities, and they traditionally have funded organizations, each of which has their own goals, their own traditions, the things they think they're good at, the reasons why they will not change from funding this particular thing. But that doesn't mean that it's hitting the real causes of poverty in a city without some willingness to kind of team up, to collaborate. And so the model of, quote, collective impact, making a difference collectively, is being adopted in a lot of places. So those are just additional pieces.
It's funny, I was just talking about the Kresge Foundation this morning, because they are the true hero of the Detroit comeback. Because back in 2008, 2009, when no one was paying attention to Detroit, they came in and said, we have to put together a plan. And they put together, and they spent 2 or 3 years, and they got the community buy-in for something called the Detroit Future City Plan. And it was an extraordinarily important part of the tool, because when we first got to Detroit looking at what to do, everybody pointed to that. And so everybody was working from that playbook. But the other thing I think is important is we can't work on urban renewal in isolation. The fact is that the nature of the global economy is changing so rapidly. And the analogy I used yesterday, we're taking snapshots and we should be looking at 3D movies because it's changing so quickly. McKinsey had a report last year, 375 million people in the developed world will have to be reskilled in the next 10 years. And so the nature of these middle-class jobs are changing, and what we're not doing is we're not hitting the most vulnerable populations. And what we have to start thinking about is how do we get these kids, particularly inner city schools, onto a pathway for those middle-class, middle-skilled jobs. And that's where I think we collectively have to do a much more effective job.
We talk about housing for just a moment. Joel, home ownership rates have been in significant decline, particularly in urban African-American and Hispanic communities, I think going back more than a decade. How important is it to bring it back, and how can we do so?
Well, the first thing is, I think one of the things we have to recognize is, just on a demographic point of view, the millennial generation is now getting into their 30s. Their phase of life where they're going to want to live with 3 roommates, and they don't really care what their environment is because they get home so late that they can't recognize where they are anyway, and who knows if they're going to come home or not. People get into their 30s. The key thing for cities is creating environments where middle-income people that will want to stay. Because what we're getting now is this bifurcation. Young hipsters, wealthy people, and then poor people. For cities to work, they have to have a middle class. Jane Jacobs made the really great comment that cities really don't lure the middle class, they create a middle class. And one of the things we're going to have to figure out is how are we going to maintain these great neighborhoods that exist in all our cities that some people would say, well, now it's a popular neighborhood, let's go densify it. Well, you destroy the very thing that made that neighborhood a great neighborhood. We had a great tour in parts of South Dallas of really charming neighborhoods that now African-American young professionals are moving, not for their 2-3 years of their urban involvement, because in many ways some of our cities are becoming like postgraduate schools. People are there for 2-3 years and then they go on and somewhere else when they grow up. They are beginning to, you've got to be able to be a place where, like I remember on a book tour, I was with a young woman who was working for the publisher, and I said, well, what's your plans to stay in New York? She says, you don't get it. We're all short-timers here. I mean, we have to figure out how do we keep at least a portion of that middle-class family in the city, because that's also going to be your lobby on schools. It's going to be a population that says, I don't want this homeless problem right now my daughter goes to school in Santa Ana with Carla's daughter. Every day she's seeing homeless people. When they go to the 7-Eleven, they're told, you've got to bring somebody else with you. You can't go to the neighborhood store by yourself in the middle of the day. Now, we have got to, A, deal with that problem, and we have to figure out a way for there to be what has been referred to as a public. What we are losing is we don't have a public. We have poor people who are struggling, who have lots of problems in terms of being able to access things. And then you've got an upper class that, frankly, they've bought their way out of the problems. You need is a middle class that cares about the long-term future of the city. That's important, not just for the city economy, but also for solving the problems that they encounter, because the very wealthy don't encounter the problems of homelessness and poverty. But I can tell you, middle class, even upper middle class people, I ride my bike almost every day, and I see just enormous poverty within 5 minutes of my house. So I have a different relationship to that poverty. I'm more concerned, I think, about it because I actually see it all the time. And I think, how do we keep these beautiful neighborhoods that are in almost every one of our cities? How do we keep them so that the next generation of people, most of them are going to go up to North Dallas, that's for sure, but will a large enough group of them stay in the core of Dallas, near the core of Dallas? I think that is a huge question, and frankly, I don't see anybody studying it.
Henry, would you like to?
Yeah, just a quick point. Jane Jacobs is right, as quoted by Joel, that cities create the middle class, but housing also, home ownership, also creates a middle class. Studies have shown that since the end of World War II, the three things that made the biggest difference in creating the very strong backbone of the middle class, which separated our country from every other economy in the world in that entire post-war period, were the GI Bill that made it possible for people to get an education. Second, wage policies that included minimum wage and wage growth. And thirdly, home ownership, because it's a form of enforced savings. For most Americans, the sum total of their net worth is the equity they have in their home. Everything else is debt. That is the equity that they've been able to build up. So yes, it is a place to live, and yes, it is stable neighborhoods and a lot of things like that, but it's also an economic policy to get people to the middle class. So at a time when people are talking, you can't pick up a business magazine without them referring to the importance of rental and multifamily and the fact that millennials are not permanent, therefore they're not permanently in a city, so they prefer rental. Cities have to understand it is in their interest to keep the production of homes for home ownership critical to the kind of middle class we want to build in our cities.
Can I just say one thing on home ownership? And I'm reluctant to, you've probably forgotten more about home ownership than I've ever known about, but one of the challenges, I think, when you say the reductions over the last 10 years, first of all, home ownership is critically important to wealth building, particularly in minority communities, number one. I think one of the challenges we've seen, and with my banker hat on, is a natural reaction to the housing and financial crisis when there was too much credit being given to people who couldn't afford it, has been to swing so far the other way that the credit box is so tight right now that it is very difficult for people to get access to the kind of mortgages they need. And this is where I think we need some federal policy to really be more thoughtful. And the Urban Institute, frankly, has done some very good work around this so that we're ensuring that we're getting the right balance. Because one of the challenges right now is, banks are very reluctant to lend except for the safest mortgages. And so it's going out to other parts of the financial sector, which, let me just say, are a bit less regulated. And so if we get into a real bubble, right, you're going to see we were solving for the last problem and are not solving for the next. And so, I think our hope has been that we have some thoughtful federal policy around housing and mortgages. And frankly, in the interim, we're spending time thinking about what are the alternative financing vehicles that we can establish to try to get credit to people who need it. Because part of the problem is they are being forced into rental housing, which is really inflated, and they're not. Right. And as a result, they're not saving any money.
And you mentioned minority populations and their interest in home ownership. The surveys that I've seen show that when asked, how do you define the American dream? Latinos and African Americans define the American dream not as a cruise or any other kind of metric, but home ownership. Yep. And the numbers are like 78% or so of people who favor home ownership. Earlier, we heard a conversation about the discussion between income and wealth. And in income, minority populations earn about, the number quoted this morning was 65%, I've heard 70% of what traditional American households earn. That's income. That's what comes in every month and goes back out. In wealth, the numbers that I have seen are about 1/10, about 10%, because minorities have not had access to pensions, long run, savings in bonds and stocks, 401ks. It's about 10%. And I think your studies have borne this out. But home ownership is a way to amass equity and own something that begins to address those numbers. The gap is about 20 points between the minority home ownership rate and the white home ownership rate. So home ownership is a strategy. If we're serious about some equity on matters of wealth and access to capital, home ownership is a very important piece of that.
And I just want to point out, maybe coming from California, I see this, the minority group that we have not discussed, which is Asians, which is the fastest growing group. And of course, in Southern California, particularly Orange County, is huge. The first thing they do is buy a house. That, the Vietnamese who came in as boat people, worked like crazy, bought a house, sometimes 2 or 3 families bought one house. That population now has that asset for that next generation. So their next generation can, do something like become university professors or something equally irrelevant. But the important thing is that somebody coming in new recognizes that this is the key. And the thing that worries me the most is that we're going to get into a situation where, and this will hurt minorities, particularly African Americans and Latinos the most, is that the only way you're going to get in is inheritance. That the people, I have a good friend in Brooklyn, she sells in the Ditmas Park area, Flatbush, and she says virtually every single deal she makes, the parents are co-signing. Well, if you're an immigrant from El Salvador, your parents probably aren't going to be co-signing your loan. And that really worries me.
I wish we had a lot longer, but we're running low. Peter, what are the most important things America needs to get right to create more inclusive urban growth, and what will success look like?
Look, I think there's not one. I think, Henry, education has to be at the heart of it. I mean, we've got to create opportunity for young people to get into the type of jobs. And I think we have to rethink how we are approaching this, because the reality is 60% of our jobs are not going to require a 4-year college degree.
Right, exactly.
Okay, and how do we get people on career pathways? But look, we have to be thinking about home ownership. We have to look at our economic interests through the prism of equity. And this is what we're doing this as JP Morgan Chase, one of the largest financial institutions in the world. We think every day about our business interests. So when we just announced, branch expansions, 400 new branches throughout the United States, 20% of those will go into low and middle income communities, because we see it in our interest as a leading financial institution to build up these communities. The fact is, if more people are working, if more people can own homes, if more neighborhoods are being revitalized, if people are saving over the long term, that's good for the broader economy, and that's good for all of our interests. And I think we just have to, I think that one of the great things that Mayor Rawlings has done here is instill in North Dallas that they have an interest in the future of Southern Dallas. Right. And I think this is what we have to be thinking about. And if we can change the mindset, and I think Henry's exactly right, the solutions are not going to come from Washington. They're not going to come from national capitals. There's a role there to play, but the solutions are going to come from cities, and they're going to come from states, and they're going to come from people getting together at the table, working together, putting all the partisan crap aside, and focusing on real solutions.
Thank you for the great work the bank is doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Henry, last word, the most important things we need to get right?
Most important thing in my view is that which I mentioned earlier, which is recognition that this can be done at the metropolitan level. We are a metropolitan nation now. The drivers of the American economy are what happens in our metros. Dallas, I don't know what proportion of this audience is from Dallas, but Dallas is an important place to America, and it's an important place to Texas. And the model that it sets, it's important. One of my heroes in the urban business was Mayor Eric Johnson, who in the 1960s created the Goals for Dallas plan. It was the first of its kind in the country. A lot of important subjects came up and were acted upon. One of them was the creation of DFW Airport, which had been a vague discussion. He made it a plan. If Dallas were to decide and show the leadership to intentionally go about addressing this issue of inequity, inequality, if you will, that has been an aspect of Dallas's reality all these years, it would be an important model for the country. It can be done with the nature of the economic growth that's here. It needs to be intentional, and it needs to involve a lot of people in an organized and collaborative way, and it needs to focus on the key elements that actually move the needle.
Thank you so much. I now have 3 responsibilities that I want to discharge. The first responsibility is to ask all of you all to join me in thanking this remarkable panel. Second, I have a number of heartfelt thanks that I want to express very quickly. I want to thank JP Morgan Chase and Company for being our presenting sponsor, the Dallas Citizens Council, our lead sponsor, Jean-Claude and Elizabeth Sada, and all of our sponsors for this event. Thank you so much. I want to thank my brilliant co-organizers, Joseph Cahoon of the Folsom Institute for Real Estate at SMU, and Joel Kotkin of the Center for Opportunity Urbanism. You can hear more from Joseph in a few minutes, just after lunch. I'd like to thank all of our stellar lineup of speakers. At SMU and at the Bush Institute, you've already heard this today, but a big part of what we do is try to bring together great leaders, thinkers, and world changers into one place to address the most pressing issues of our time. I strongly believe today we have succeeded. I'd also like to thank my colleague Ken Hirsch and Holly Kuzmich, Steve Corral, and especially President and Mrs. Bush for supporting this whole new line of work at the Bush Center. I hope that we will make the Bush Center proud. And last but not least, I want to thank Anisha Williams, Kristen Kent-Spanos, Jenny Viatoro, Megan Best, Annie Walker, and the whole remarkably talented Bush Center team. You all have done an amazing job today. So So bravo. Okay, now comes the good part. My third and final responsibility is to tell you what's happening next. We're going to go out to lunch in a moment. You have heard from a lot of great speakers on the stage. We're not going to have a speaker at lunch. We want you all to speak to each other and to our panelists, and we want to encourage us all to brainstorm together. At 1:15, if you all are able, we invite everyone to join us in one of 3 concurrent working sessions on the business sector, the nonprofit sector, and a third session on creating dynamic, upwardly mobile communities. We have fantastic panels in those groups too, and we see those as roll up your sleeves working sessions. We want to get everybody bringing their own questions, their own insights, and their own wisdom to that. Let me just say in conclusion, as we look beyond this event, we really encourage all of you all to stay in touch and engage with this program at the Bush Institute. The collective brainpower in this room really can make a transformative difference in our city and in our country. Let's all figure out how to be part of the solution. So thank you very much. Enjoy lunch.